Okay, so today what we're going to do is we're going to start on 6-4. We're not going to finish them today, but that is completely fine. These are going to go on page 77 when you're finished. Today we're going to solve rational equations, which means equations made up of fractions. So to solve an equation containing a rational expression, To solve an equation containing a rational expression, the first thing you need to do is you need to factor all of the denominators. After you factor all of the denominators, the whole point of this for the last few days has been to find the least common denominator out of every fraction in the equation. You're going to take that least common denominator and you're going to multiply every term on both sides of the equation by that least common denominator, all the factors that are in it. You're going to simplify so that you no longer have any fractions, yay. And then you're going to solve for x. And you're going to have to check to make sure that your solution doesn't make the denominator 0, because we can't have denominators of 0. So in example 1, I look at my denominator. It only has one factor. It's completely factored, and I can tell that because x doesn't have an exponent. So my least common denominator is just the denominator I have, 2x minus 3. So I have not needed to factor, but I did find the least common denominator. So now I'm going to multiply every term on both sides of the equation by 2x minus 3. So I'm going to take this term and multiply it by 2x minus 3. And I'm going to take this term and multiply it by 2x minus 3. Because what I do to one piece of the equation, I have to do to every piece in order to remain balanced. Now I want to simplify. And in order to simplify, I want to recall a couple days ago when we talked about if you have the same thing on common on top and on bottom, then you can cancel them out. So on the left side, all I'm left with is a 1 and then an equal sign. And then nothing cancels out here, so I'm going to rewrite 4 times 2x minus 3. In order to make this look a little bit nicer, sorry for these, they keep popping up, I need to distribute. So 1 equals 4 times 2x, which is 8x, and 4 times negative 3, which is negative 12. And now you have a nice simple equation. The whole purpose of factoring, finding the least common denominator, and multiplying and simplifying is to get to an equation that's easy to solve. So I can add my constant, or the opposite of my constant. 1 plus 12 is 13. And I can tell this is not going to be a nice, pretty answer. However, we've been dealing with fractions a lot lately, so I think that it's going to be fine. So this is supposed to be my solution. I've simplified, I have solved for x, and now I need to check to make sure that my solution will not create a denominator of 0, because I don't want that. I can't divide by 0. So the way that you check is you take every factor of your least common denominator, which there only turns out to be 1 right now, and you set it to be not equal to 0. That way when you solve for x, you can find the number that x cannot be and compare it with the solution that you got. So when I solve for x here, add 3 to both sides. 0 plus 3 is 3. So 2x cannot be equal to 3. And if I divide both sides, I have that x cannot be equal to 3/2, which is completely fine because what we found for the solution was 13/8, and that's not 3/2. So 13/8 will not make the denominator 0, therefore 13/8 is our solution. So in number 2, and for every remaining problem after that, I went ahead and wrote our list of steps so that we can refer back to them. On number 2, I need to factor the denominator, and I notice the denominator shows up as x and x. So there's really no other uncommon terms for those denominators. My least common denominator is x. So I didn't have to factor. We can go through that step, but I did find the least common denominator. So my next step is to do what? It's to multiply. So I'm going to multiply every term, this one, and this one, all by x. And I can tell that there are 3 terms because they're separated by a plus sign, a minus sign, or an equal sign. So I'm going to multiply this term by x, 2 by x, 6 by x. And some of you may think I'm not multiplying the denominators by x, but I'm multiplying that term by x. So 5 over x times x, 2 times x, 6 over x times x. So all those x's are up in the numerators. And I can simplify. I see an x on top and an x on bottom, so they cancel out, and 5 remains, plus 2 times x equals x on top and x on bottom, again cancel out. Nice pretty equation for us to solve. So go ahead and pause the video and solve your equation. Once you solved, did you get 1/2? If so, the next step is to check to make sure that it doesn't create a 0 denominator. So I take my factors from my least common denominator, and the only thing was x, and I set it to be not equal to 0. There's no solving, that's already solved. So if x cannot be 0 and the solution I came up with was 1/2, well then 1/2 will work. It will solve my equation, and it will also not create a 0 denominator. So my solution is 1/2. Okay. Moving on to number 3. On number 3, I do notice that I have something with an exponent. So x squared plus x can be factored. I can divide both of those by x. So x comes out. X squared divided by x is an x. Positive x divided by x is a positive 1. So my two factors are x and x plus 1. So I have factored all of my denominators. The other two did not need to be factored. So I now need to determine my least common denominator. Remember from yesterday that it needs to have all the parts from all the denominators. So I notice that x minus 1 shows up, or sorry, x plus 1, not x minus 1. And I notice that x shows up. And I notice that there are no other pieces, I notice that there are no other pieces for denominators, so that must be my least common denominator. So next step is to multiply all of my terms. How many terms are there? Think to yourself. There are 3 terms. So I'm going to multiply this term by x plus 1 and x. I'm going to multiply this term by x plus 1 and x. I'm going to multiply this term by x plus 1 and x. I notice in the first term, which is rather large and oddly shaped, that I have an x plus 1 on top and an x plus 1 on the bottom. They have those in common. They're eliminated, as are the x's. So the only thing remaining from the first term is the 3. Plus, what cancels out in the second term? The x minus 1's. So what's left is the 3 and the x. Equals, what cancels out in the second term? The x and the x. So what's left is negative 1 times x plus 1. In order to complete this problem, you do have to distribute. So negative 1 times x is negative x, and negative 1 times 1 is minus 1. I have x's on each side, so I need to move them to be together. I'm going to move the smaller x term, so I'm going to add x to both sides. 3x plus x is 4x. And if I chose to move my x's to the left, that means I need to move my constants, 3 and negative 1. I need those to be over on the right. So I'm going to subtract 3, and I'm going to subtract 3. And negative 1 minus 3 is negative 4. You could probably see what the value of x is going to be. X must be negative 1. So now that you have multiplied, sorry, I didn't check these off as I went. We simplified, so we crossed out common factors, and we solved. We got an x value of negative 1. Now I need to check. So I need to check to make sure that each term in my denominator, each factor in my denominator, this one and this one, I need them to not be 0. So I'm going to do the easy one first. I'm going to take x, and I don't want x to be 0. Easy enough, that doesn't affect this. Next factor is x plus 1. I don't want x plus 1 to be 0. So if I solve and subtract x from both sides, x cannot be 0 minus 1, which is negative 1. An x value of negative 1 will make my denominator 0, which is a problem because here my solution was negative 1, so that means that negative 1 is not going to work. It's going to create problems in my equation, so this is extraneous. And since it was our only solution possibility and it doesn't work, that means we have no solution. So I'm going to flip to the next problem. And I'd like for you to try it on your own. I'd like for you to pause the video and try each step. I'm going to show you step by step, but I'm not going to explain it. I'm just going to show you like each chunk of work. So the first step is going to be to factor. So pause the video and factor and check back. The factor step is in green. Next step in a different color will be to find the least common denominator. So pause the video and find the least common denominator. Check your least common denominator with mine. Mine has all the parts from each denominator. Next step is to multiply. So pause the video and multiply each term by the least common denominator. So yours should look like mine. Pause the video and do the next step, which is to simplify any common factors you see on top and bottom. So pause the video. Check your work with mine. Next step is to solve. So go ahead and solve. Pause the video. Go ahead and check your work. You might want to pause the screen so that you can compare each line. The last thing that you need to do is to check to make sure your solutions don't make the denominator 0. So pause the video and do that, please. So go ahead and check. You're checking with mine. The solutions are -4 and 1. So for the remainder of the class period, you need to work on your homework assignment. And if you didn't finish this video, then you need to go ahead and finish it at home so that tomorrow we can talk more about it. Have a great day.